Welcome to another Kame House training lobby with the 2MK team. Today, we're probably going to be working primarily on spacing stuff, getting your opponent to the corner, and how to win based on that. While this game does not have ring outs, it's fairly important that you understand how to get your opponent to the corner to keep up your attacks. In this type of game, there's always more damage to be had by doing combos on a cornered opponent because the pushback of air combos doesn't change that much and more combo options open up. So we'll be looking at characters, what they're capable of doing relative to getting the opponent to the corner, and what their plan in the mid-screen should be to get their opponent there as soon as possible. Or if they're a character that doesn't specifically need to do this and their damage is about the same either way, whether or not they can benefit from trying to stay in the mid-screen so that their opponent can't vanish, get behind them, do tricky stuff, and put them in the corner instead. As you can see, the game already uses a very quick system for getting you to the corner. Normally, one full combo from many characters is able to put you there. If the character is less likely to pull you toward them than others, getting the opponent to the corner is relatively easy. However, there are some things that are a little bit difficult to see in terms of how it flows. For example, despite the fact that Dragon Rush looks like it really does push you quite a bit far back, it doesn't actually do this. If you Dragon Rush someone in mid-screen, you zoom into the air to follow up the combo, but the positions you were in the stage don't really change that much. This is something that you need to pay a lot of attention to. Similarly, as you can see here, Boo does not actually move the opponent to the corner with his stuff. Therefore, one of the easiest tactics you can see normally is for your opponent to keep doing things in neutral so that you have to block and can therefore be pushed back to the corner. The easiest counter to this, which I will hopefully demonstrate in the next match, is if you know that your opponent constantly hits buttons to keep you from being able to reposition yourself in neutral, the deflect mechanic is relatively strong in this game. And the amount of time it takes to bait a deflect, especially with characters who do not have very strong long-range attacks, drastically increases the amount of time you have to reposition yourself. Because the deflect also pushes your opponent so far back relative to most other things, you can easily use it for this purpose. Since they cannot afford to simply attack you, and you get to keep up your defense, trapping someone in the corner and then deflecting their stuff, depending on the character, can give you a lot of advantage. And in turn, there are characters who are good at getting you to the corner and keeping you there because they don't have that limitation. You can use this strongly when your opponent is flustered and wants to specifically get out of the corner. To keep them there until you are more comfortable and ready to set up your mix-up. However, each character does have their own specific ways of being, and some of them can get out of this setup. Trunks being the first that you would see do this to you naturally. Once you have control of the spacing of your opponent being in the corner or not, they also lose the ability to move away from you as a defense. So if you incorporate that level of thinking into your play, and practice what we were talking about last week, namely specifically knowing what to do after your deflect, you can set up that sort of situation. Your opponent is already in a situation that they are more afraid of than you are. You are pressuring them in the corner. You don't exactly know what to press, but you know that they are probably going to do something. If they intend to do something and you don't know what to do yourself, using your Vanish can be a good option for you to shift the position because you expect them to try to get out. But using your Deflect is a better option for you because Vanish doesn't necessarily lead to anything. Vanish also risks you getting put back in the corner when you mess it up, whereas your Deflect has really no downside. Similarly, if you play characters who are not good at pushing the opponent back, or who put themselves at great risk to do so, you often have to figure out how to play well at mid-screen, with or without moving around too much yourself. It is to the advantage of characters who are good at pushing to the corner to try to do so quickly, because they only need to get 1 or 2 interactions correct in order to succeed at this. Characters who are not so good at pushing to the corner will need to have multiple correct interactions or use more meter to get the opponent cornered, and as a result, you risk a lot more reversals and turnarounds and being pushed back, or having the situation entirely turned around on you by your opponent using Vanish at the right moment during your pressure, and you are the one that ends up cornered. Certain other moves, such as Trunks' auto combo, will set up the same sort of situation for you. You can treat Trunks therefore as somewhat of a defensive character precisely because he can do that.
覚悟はいいか。チン。
どうした。
シェリア。行くぞ。
お願いします。なんだ。
俺なら逃げられくれ。チンシェリア。
いっぱい飛ばすぞ。あいつ本当に強いよ。そら惜しかったんだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。やるね。センズラ食え。だから的な。やるね。やるね。そらやそら逃がさないぞ。任せてください。
1対1ならこの次。行くぞ。覚悟はいいか。行くぞ。そこか。究極のパワーを見せてやる。捕まれ。まだいける。
大丈夫か。
終わりだ。ターゲットは俺が仕留める。見えているぞ。まぐれだ。この攻撃だ。こいつ逃がさん。これはどう。こちらだ。これはどうだ。こちらだ。甘い。さてこちらも食らえ。交代できますか。こちら分かっていても防げる。
なんだよ。
これはどうだ。
なんだ。どうだ。逃がさないぞ。
バカだ。
なんだ。俺も結構やるじゃん。
Furthermore, when you are a character who can defend themselves well in the corner, but also has good decent ways of doing that, your better method is normally to stay closer to the corner and zone your opponent out, because they are going to constantly try to get in on you, especially if they're the type of character who needs to do that to get their damage. Stay in the corner yourself, at least some of the time, if you realize that your opponent has trouble opening you up, because you end up with the most possible space in front of you, but your opponent can't necessarily gain a lot from going for raw vanish. They'll clip you and not get any startup, but throw you far away from them, which in turn makes you as a zoner character able to lock them down with them in the corner now, with even less options for them to get out and deal with other things, forcing them to use Vanish again, or just to give you a whole screen to retreat into while you slowly chip away at them. In addition to that, please note that the natural retreat point for attack with no button is normally away from your opponent if they are attacking.
今の構えはこうだ。これはどうだ。来るか。来い。見せてみろ。こういう攻撃もある。見せてみ。これはどうだ。こちらだ。これはどうだ。見えているぞ。来るか。こちらだ。無駄だ。逃がさん。
貴様の相手はこの僕だ。焦るよっしゃ。
バカだ。
ちょっとやりすぎたかな。僕を吸収するつもりではないようだけど、なぜ僕の味方をするんだ。
The outcome of this fight is anybody's guess!
お願いします、ピッコロさん。
On the other hand, characters who work mostly on counters and spacing want to stay out of the corner as much as possible. The longer your opponent has to deal with you in certain spaces, the worse off you generally are. Therefore, one good way to deal with this problem from all sides, especially with that sort of character, is if you expect your opponent to be doing things at that range and they are defending a lot, max range stand heavy. The power of this max range stand heavy kick, this normally kick, is that it's not naturally easy to punish for most people. And it's very tempting for them to wait and block it, when you therefore would be able to do other things. However, if you play that type of character, them deflecting that particular move does not harm you at all. And it allows you to play far more patiently than most other options. While getting a lot of position toward the corner for your opponent. For opponents who don't normally defend a lot, and therefore press a lot of buttons in neutral. You can use this to stop them and make them go back to the form of them that you can handle easier.
やってやるか。
So by using your moves to shift your opponent's general mindset, you can control how easy it is to get them to the corner and how easy it is to keep yourself out of it. Some characters do not need to use their heavy kick because they have other buttons that move them forward in this timing. And you can just push through with things like that. So Boo can do this in both of his forms. Hit has this ability, Cell to some extent, and Frieza, sorta. Nappa can also do this in certain situations. Note that this is different from using your auto combo because your auto combo specifically has no direct priority in terms of moving forward. Some auto combos don't even move forward all that well. They're also extremely easily telegraphed, and because they have so much startup, and you must take an action so your opponent can't assume, can assume that you're doing something because they see the first two hits. They can go for a zoning move to keep you out, or just recognize the timing and parry the last hit fairly easily, for example. So be careful with this.
調子に乗るな。
行くぞ。なんの。甘い。様の相手はこの僕だ。よっとよっ。そうだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。まだまだ。行くぞ。トライだ。どうだ。行くぞ。まだまだ。よっ。おて。兄ちゃん。
今度は俺が相手です。もっと強くならなければ。
Combining this information with last week's discussion, characters who have full screen beams are able to use these from the corner and combo them into their vanish attacks. By doing this, you have basically reversed positions with your opponent, and depending on how quickly they can cross the screen, can set up mix-ups that follow this. This is another one of the many differences between characters that are not so obvious, because in order to understand the differences between characters, you must combine universal mechanics with other things that this character specifically can do that interact with those universal mechanics in ways that lead to good situations for you. Piccolo is not one of these characters. In fact, I play none of them functionally. I believe 18 can get it done to some extent. But overall, Piccolo generally won't be backing into a corner and then throwing this and hoping to cancel it, because this is actually just a regular Ki Blast, and you can get through it without doing any work. And since he doesn't have a way to do that either, what characters like Piccolo end up needing is to knock the opponent far enough away to do that dash jump that I just did. The reason why this dash jump is a useful thing for this type of character is that unlike most characters, they have so many good ways of baiting the opponent and so many useful things they can do when landing in the direct space right next to them that they don't have to worry about what happens if they end up right there like that. While this game does not use jump-ins in the same way that most fighting games that people are comfortable with do, if you are a KOF player or have been familiar with the game, you will have a better idea of this sort of jump and what your opponent can and cannot do about it. Especially for a character who can otherwise mess up the opponent's response.
調子に乗るな。来い。逃がさん。ここを頼む。今の構えはこうだ。俺は成長を続けている。今の構えはこうだ。
早く勝負をつけなきゃね。黙っときな。うい驚いたよ。逃げたら逃げてもいいよ。17号。驚いていい加減にしろ。そら逃げたきゃ逃げてもいいよ。逃げたきゃ逃げてもいいよ。
The key to this is whether or not your character is able to do it on something that's not necessarily a knockdown, or some way to make sure that your enemy cannot respond in time. Understanding this is what sets characters apart, and it's more and more important every time you play this game, every time you watch the stream, to pay attention to what is actually setting characters apart, because it's really difficult to understand what the style of a character is just based on their moves, because universal mechanics feel universal. You figure they use them the same with everyone. But that is not how it works in general. For example, characters who are really terrible at this are in fact Adult Gohan and to some extent Trunks. Adult Gohan has basically nothing he can actually do other than one very small attack, which is easily beaten by the opponent doing anti-air super dash. He really has no option here. So this is not something you aim to do with Gohan. Trunks has one or two, but they're not that great. Krillin, on the other hand, can do anything he wants. The problem being that Krillin is not as good at getting the knockdown required to do that. This game's characters can therefore be broken down into sets of skills that they functionally have. And your character choices can be based on which of those skills you're most attached to. Using that information as example, you could say that Kid Buu does not actually have the ability to fight well out of the corner, because his vanish attacks don't lead into anything, and he doesn't have anything to combo into them. If he happens to clip you with his Candy Beam, however, obviously he will get out. But even then, he still hasn't gotten the same sort of advantage that a character with a beam can, without a bit more execution, specifically being able to do instant jump, pink Kamehameha. On the other hand, Vegeta Blue is actually relatively good at this because Big Bang attack in the air can be angled downward. So a simple dash, hop, jump serves him relatively well. If the opponent goes up into the air, he can do different attacks to stop them, or you can try to get in with the actual jumping hit and lead to some damage. Now, depending on the character, you may have to put a lot of effort into making this actually work for you, because your opponent's obvious option is just to deflect you or to use their crouch heavy. At that point, it's become the equivalent of what we are used to in more fighting games such as King of Fighters and Street Fighter, and to some extent Marvel, because there are definitely times when Marvel Footsies does work like this. It is pushing them back to the basic anti-air strategy. The problem is that the basic anti-air doesn't work on certain characters because you can be baited into various things. It does take some execution from the player to make this work for them, but it is a valid way of approaching the match if you have that sort of character, where your opponent cannot just go, okay, I'll anti-air you. If you want a parallel to this, characters from Street Fighter like this are Nakali, Akuma. Characters from King of Fighters like this are Leona and I believe Shun-A to some extent. Injustice, I don't actually know who does this well in Injustice. I know people who do it in Injustice, but like it's a little telegraphed in Injustice for most characters. Maybe Raiden. This is particularly good against characters who have good anti-airs but relatively slow ones, and similarly good keep out normals but again relatively slow ones.
こういう攻撃もある。来るか。見せてみろ。無駄だ。
全力でいくぞ。
こらえ。背後に気をつけろ。覚悟はいいか。行くぞ。逃げ道はなくなった。こいつは俺のターゲットだ。見えてるぞ。皆さん
逃げたく逃げてもいいよ。手を離す。やるね。どこ見てんのさ。はっ黙っときな。
調子に乗る。
楽しもうか。行くよ17号。
わかったわかった。
この俺様だ。じゃあね。バイ。
Controlling that space against very flingy players is a much higher advantage than controlling it against anyone else. Because their mind is on offense, their mind is on what they can do based on the fact that you're approaching. But when you have a character with many options on approach, there's basically no way for them to react properly. They'll just overload themselves. It is a mix-up at a range that sort of player is not used to mix-ups existing at, which is different from zoning. It's why it is relatively difficult to define the sort of character I play, because I am actually playing characters with long-range mix-ups.
こんなものか。これから見せるのが本当の力だ。無駄だ。ビッグバンやろう。点数をつけるとすれば30点ってとこ。そんなとばかな。
One easy way to remember this, however, is that for no current character that I have ever seen does their down spike attack from their air combo set this up. You get a different sort of mix-up and meaty pressure. Depending on the character, this may be really good or it might be really terrible, but overall, if you want to test this for your own characters, your aim is not to ever knock your opponent up or down, but specifically just to knock them away, often in a way that they're unlikely to tech out of. Or if they do, they stay close to the ground.
Get ready for battle.
One good example here is that the preferred Android 18 combo for doing this, rather than using her air cancels to push her upward and get actually around the same amount of damage, you just use her key blast button to juggle them across the screen. The opponent is functionally already in recovery, and unless they immediately start their super dash, they're not going to pass through those. And if you were doing it as a combo, they can't. They're already getting hit.
Ready? Let's go.
Note that a raw stand heavy leaves you too far to pull this off, which is even more important for most characters. However, you should check whether or not your stand heavy has different properties when used in a combo or after another special move. You'll notice there, for example, that Piccolo's combo that I was looking for something to do after last week is basically exactly this. So I get my space control and something specific to do after it. Of course, landing your stand heavy in neutral is no real problem because you can always super dash straight after it. But please note that your super dash may lead to a ground spike. As you'll notice with 18, I generally am not actually doing any ground spike attack, even though I technically can. Because she has some other weird options in the air combo department that bring the opponent down at a spacing that I'm perfectly willing to mess with. You can see that there, I have a bit more control and a bit more time to set up any post-hit mix-up. So if you feel that this game is unfamiliar and you can't do things like cross-ups or jump-ins, it is because the game does not give you those things off of basic auto combos. Well, for a few characters you get them off auto combos, but in general, your auto combo will lead to you spiking the opponent back down, and unless they're in the corner, like that, you won't get what you were aiming for before. Obviously, as you can see there, a good way to stop this situation is to just use your big super. But depending on the character, this may literally not even work for you. Especially if your opponent can bait it and just vanish away from it. It depends heavily on what exactly the move is and how quick it comes out. Goku, for example, is super weak to this because his super doesn't hit people who are off the ground. Piccolo is extremely strong against it because he has like 9 different ways to stop you from actually getting in on him, and they're all basically guaranteed.
The battle's about to start. Good luck. Get ready. Let's go.
Fortunately, as you can see from Trunks, Trunks really has an overhead that he can use in this same situation after. Now most characters don't have. His overhead reaches far enough that if he does hit the opponent down, with a down spike, and for some reason he's pretty sure that they're not going to be ready, he can literally just do that. But the direction that his opponent techs affects his effectiveness. And he has to commit to it before he actually knows for sure whether or not they're teched in order to be sure that he will catch them. So he doesn't have that variability that other characters have, but he does have a really strong capacity against people who he can condition. This allows Trunks to condition the opponent to constantly recover back in order to escape from the move, and then change the expectation at the last moment and call an assist or do a different move, or otherwise just make their life miserable. Whereas, as you can see, Gohan basically has nothing. He uses meter to do pretty much anything at all, and the thing he does is really, really obvious. It's also easily stopped by Vanish, most supers, etc. Therefore, you must decide what you're looking for in a character in terms of mix-ups off their knockdowns. Do you want to push them out and keep zoning them? Do you want to get close to them and make them nervous with moves that are good at this, or condition them with moves that are safe, but that they must always block?
This should be a great fight.
Your other options are mostly getting in a way that is unpredictable even to your opponent, making them flinch on final defense point, And for the more basic characters in the game, playing neutral by moving to your own preferred position and putting down something that they will not be able to get away from. Homing moves such as Cybermen and Gotenks Galactic Donut and certain of Cell's moves are based on this. Using a lot of tracking to make it so that you can stand wherever you want and your opponent has to deal with that. But as you can see, approaching on the ground is a terrible idea. There are some nuanced things in here as well. Because you're dashing, you're super hot, let's call it super hot for now, puts you on the other side of the opponent. If you spend a little bit longer moving forward, you can use this to land on the other side of them. If your character does not have a forward moving second hit on their light auto combo, you may be in trouble because you won't be able to clip them. And this can be fairly dangerous for you. Medium auto combos are usually fairly good with it, but there are some characters who don't have good mediums for the job either. The concept basically being that if you end up on the other side of them and your opponent happen to move forward with any of their moves or their approaches to hitting you, and you end up swinging and missing because of this, you may be the one that ends up getting hurt. So a character that does, let's call them empty top cross-ups, generally needs to have an auto combo or a really long medium button.
あんま似合ってうわよっまずいどうしたマセコ行くぞマセコ無事だバカだ貴様の相手はこの僕だどうした
As you can see, Adult Gohan is also a very straightforward character in that even though he can do a beam into vanish combo, the execution for actually getting anything off it is much heavier than most other characters, making him very meter hungry for using that particular playstyle. Nothing prevents you from using it, but you might not want to put him on point if you're going to do it. Krillin, on the other hand, for various reasons, mostly related to how far his vanish attack puts him, is very good at converting off those. Compounded by the fact that Krillin can be even trickier about his Kamehameha and will end up being able to do this to even people in the air. In Krillin's case, it's more so a matter of timing than anything else. And he has a much larger capacity for clipping and going into air combos, whereas characters who don't have as good air combos or who can't convert as easily into air combos off of stray low mediums on bounced opponents and similar things can't get any of that.
Time to begin the match!
So if we look at the progression, always make sure that you don't give up on the things that your character does because they seem useless. They're probably either designed in, because honestly, fighting game characters are fairly heavily tweaked these days. the designers tend to have a very good idea exactly what they want the character to do. And they tend to make this very clear. Solving the puzzle of what exactly your character is meant to do can be a real struggle in this sort of game, where you don't have past things to go on, you don't have advice from other players to go with because they don't always know themselves. And you don't necessarily have any clear ideas about what the universal mechanics allow you to get because you aren't so clear about your opponent's defenses. It's easy to get into a rhythm where you think you know what you're doing, and then you meet one opponent who basically disproves the entire theory you had about how your mix-up or approach works in the first place. However, it's generally safe to have at least some faith in how things play out between your characters and most other characters in the game. And this is why it's important to get advantage against many characters.
Are you ready?
Note that I cannot deflect that, for example.
覚悟はいいか。18号やるな。せや
Similarly, that worked, but it's not that great. It didn't do that much damage.
覚悟はいいか。
いますよ。
逃げろ。18号これならどうだ。せや覚悟はいいか。
どうした。
交代だ。
うい。
見えているぞ。食らえ。これはどうだ。こちらだ。これはどこちらだ。止まれ。食らえ。防いでみせろ。
軽いね。黙っときな。頼んだよ。うい。
覚悟はいいか。覚悟はいいか。あかんこう。お前の構えは。俺は成長を続けている。来い。これはどうだ。こちらだ。無駄だ。マグタ。今の構えは。俺は成長を続けている。
うるさいね。
17号の試合を。
どうした。いい加減にしてこいつはどうだい。くらえ。ちだ。待つよ。加減が難しいんだよ。黙っときな。こいつはどうだい。くらえ。またな。
Once you are able to put more pressure on your opponent with all of these pieces, you are not only going to feel more comfortable and confident yourself and therefore able to pull off more things, but you will feel as if you understand it more when they respond in correct ways. It's easy to get discouraged when you find something that's working but you don't understand why it's working, and then an opponent stops it. However, if you understand why it normally works, and your opponent just happens to make a choice which is a good idea in that situation but would not consistently be one, it's harder to discourage you from continuing with your basic game plan. And while autopilot is a generally bad way to lose this sort of game, autopiloting your character's main options is generally not as terrible, unless your opponent has some very hard counters to them.
馬を来てくれ。
なぜだ。
紹介できますか。
この程度
手触りだ。どうだ。よっと飛べ。何も逃がさないぞ。どうだ。
あこだ。
行くぞ。捕らえた。
遅い。
どうだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。
無駄だ。
逃がさないぞ。行くぞ。捕らえた。
こいつはどうだ。くらえ。この場に
まいったあの時とは違うぞ。
何か。
Characters like the ones you're seeing played now have another advantage altogether. Because they have moves that instantly bring them down, they can use upward tech when trapped in combos and similar. Or, in certain situations where they are not necessarily sure if they could be comfortable or if the opponent is going to press more attacks, they can literally hold up as a defense. With good execution, they can hold up and then block in the air before deciding if to do a move. So as you can see for Go Tanks, if he happens to just hold up when put under pressure, he gets out of a lot of things without losing a lot of his offense. Cell loses more offense, but Cell can literally convert off stuff that he hits after doing so. And Vegeta, if he really wants to, can just come back down. So it never comes up in a way that matters for the setups.
大人になって一緒に戦うなんてなんだか不思議な感じですね。
I'm still getting used to the fact that seeing connection has been lost at the end of a match does not necessarily mean that everything has been lost.
This should be a great fight. Ready?
食らっときな。だからはっ
せいぜい楽しませてくれよこのベジータ。行くぞ。見せてみろ。こちらだ。どうだ。こちらだ。見えているぞ。無駄だ。来い。逃がさん。
軽いね。17号。いい加減にしろ。今度は本気でやらせてもらうぞ。押しかん。行くよ17号。分かった分かった。17号かけてもらうよ。
無駄だ。終わりだ。この程度か。くだらん。俺ならどうだ。この程度か。受けてみろ。覚悟はいいか。くだらん。行くぞ。甘い。この程度か。覚悟はいいか。全体この私。よっしゃ逃げられるか。逃げられるか。逃げられるか。逃げられるか。逃げられるか。俺ならどうだ。ターゲットは俺が仕留める。まぐれだ。今の構えはこうだ。行くこちらだ。ターゲット排除。
Similarly, imitating the way that someone else plays a character may not work out for you because the character may have more than one way to be played, and your choice as to how to achieve that doesn't match your natural style. Characters who are more limited in how they approach matches and execution heavy tend to have better options of this type.
Get ready for a Dragon Ball Rumble!
初めから全力でかかってくるんだな。
Get ready!
く
As you can see, the way that your opponent techs out of your vanish attack when they do get clipped by a long-range one tells you a bit about them, but normally can't lead to you being in danger. It's important, therefore, to pay attention to how your opponent techs out of your vanish to figure out what you want to do. Though you should probably normally keep doing the same things if you continue to be safe by doing so. After all, that is generally for defense and repositioning rather than this is the way you intend to get pressure started. In general, it will not change the distance between you and an opponent unless they start attacking toward you because they specifically want to be closer. If you are playing the sort of character where that is the goal, it will tend to shift on its own.
すぐに終わらせてやる。防いでみろ。許さん。チャンもらえ。さすが無駄だ。
いいね。驚いたよ。どこ見てるのか。見逃すこの野郎。17号
やってやるか。
やっまだまだ17号
間違えた。
もうそろそろ殺してしまうぞ。カメハメハカチャくらえ。交代しろ。覚悟はいいか。ここは譲ってやる。このベジータ様を失望させるなよ。甘い。行くぞ。終わりだ。終わりだ。それならどうだ。
うるさいね。
そこだ。覚悟はいいか。覚悟はいいか。交代だ。
もっと楽しもう。驚いたよ。黙っときな。逃げたく逃げてもいいよ。黙っときな。黙っときな。
サバにはちょうどいい最後だ。
まだまだ。やっ。驚いたよ。17の気持ちはどうだい。
覚悟はいいか。すぐに終わらせてやる。こらえ。これはどこちらだ。来るか。来るか。来るか。いくつ。来るか。こちらだ。今の構えは。俺は成長を続けている。任務完了だ。仕事は終えた。次のターゲットは誰だ。
Once you understand your own motion, you can say that you understand your character. The difficulty is in which parts of the motion to pay attention to. However, not to worry, even though this week will be focused almost completely on things like repositioning through vanish and so on, there really is only one more core lesson that applies to all characters to be learned, which we will obviously cover next week.
A fierce showdown is about to begin.
Therefore, in order to make sure that you understand it, the main thing to note as coming from last week is you can dash forward and Z change. If your character has moves that counter or stop opponent's moves well, that's another option. Doing your own super dash fairly early on into it helps, as well as certain crouching moves and auto combos. If you don't want to stay on the ground, you should try to make sure that you have a character who is okay with not doing that, or who gets something off it. Deflecting on your own approach is mostly for characters who can punish heavily off of their own deflect, need to push their opponent back but don't have good ways to get in and do that, and who don't have long enough auto combos to force the issue. If you don't play a team that has good assists for locking your opponent down, this may be a thing you need to do, precisely because your opponent is going to figure that they can't be locked down. As you can see, exchanges like that end up very meter heavy because both characters are focused on getting the other back into the corner. Sometimes it's easier to just let this go. However, if you use defensive assists, your opponent loses the capacity to get some of their stronger corner mix-ups because you can simply make sure that they get clipped out of them, forcing them to rely on their Dragon Rush, which you can easily tech. If you play characters that tech backwards in most situations, you should usually prepare to do either a zoning attack, since raw banish is not generally going to hurt you from your opponent, or a long range auto combo if they happen to have that. If you tend to tech upwards, your aim is generally to be as patient as possible, or to use your vanish to get to your opponent while you are in the air, which is always possible. And if your tendency is to tech forward, you generally should lock and prepare to tech other players' Dragon Rushes. This does not specifically apply to people knowing what you're going to do, but simply that the rhythm of the game favors those in those situations. If you tech backward, opponents who were pressuring and see you move backward will generally automatically, without even thinking about it, do a move that attacks relatively far out. If you tech upward, they may try to catch you, or they'll probably be patient on their own. If they're the type to try to catch you, you can use your own vanish to clip them, or any of your own moves that bring you downward. And if you tech forward, you can generally be sure that if they recognize that you didn't end it too far away, they'll just hit more buttons. Understanding which way your opponent tends to tech can give you a fair idea of how to finish your own combos. Against opponents that tech backward, especially on being knocked down, you generally should go for an air dash to get in again, even if nothing comes of it. Opponents who tend to tech neutrally or up, in this case from ground, can be most accurately defeated by doing a Z change to calling your next character, as they tend to bounce upward into the super dash that the Z change starts. And for people who tap forward, if you have any moves that bring you down, you are better off using those. Because of the pace of this game, it's much less likely that an opponent will generally be choosing which direction to tech, especially since you can always stop your own combos early or use things that don't hit as hard and also don't have specific durations. For example, the aforementioned reset, dropping the combo so that your opponent techs in the wrong direction and ends up in another combo.
about to start. Good luck.
So in this case, let's look at a comparison between the motion used by this team, who tends to go upward, and the motions used by me. One of the easiest ways to control which way you tech and keep your opponent off guard is to let all of the tension go out of your body the moment you take damage. In other words, as soon as you take a hit, let go of the stick. Opponents who are very used to their targets teching all the time will often be caught off guard by someone who just doesn't. However, the tech window in this game is quite large, and momentarily making yourself not think because of it is not likely to rob you entirely of your ability to do anything. You can usually still tech. Not just as a general tech thing, trying to deflect special beam cannons when Piccolo is that close to you will lead to that happening 90% of the time. Just hit him.
This should be a great fight. Ready?
Watching this will also drastically improve your defense in this game. Because a lot of what we consider to be defense in this game is actually rather not making the mistakes before then. The pace of the game makes it very difficult to figure out exactly what action to take in a given time frame. when you don't know where you're going to be relative to your opponent. Therefore, if you control where you expect to be relative to your opponent, it's easier to defend. Your flow improves drastically. And you don't end up hitting buttons and not being at the correct range for those buttons. Obviously, sometimes you'll still overcommit and get punished, but you'll generally know why that happened and not end up flustered. This doesn't even mean that one needs to block most or even all of the time. In fact, if anything, it frees you up to press more attacks and go for more properly spaced defensive techniques, as well as using your assists more effectively because you generally don't have a lot of confusing interactions, which gives you a lot of time for your assist to recharge. You can think of characters like Cell and Gotenks to some extent as the grapplers of this game because they are good at making sure that you are where they want you to be after their moves, and they can decide that mid-combo. As opposed to characters like Gohan who are effectively rushed down because they always put you in the same place, but that place is advantageous to them to some extent. If you're familiar with the team and their general choices in character, it should be therefore relatively easy to see why the character choices that were made were generally made. Kazuki Dynasty tends to play characters similar to Kame and Kame with a lot of relatively canned knockdowns, Mukis, mix-ups, and so on. But good footsies. Raz Just Fine tends to be playing more so, not necessarily pure grapplers, but characters that have this mix-up potential to put you down. This sort of information is the sort of thing you should be trying to figure out for your friends that play this game as well, or just people you generally encounter online and have long sets with. Because understanding why they choose their characters can help you understand where in their flow they tend to be at any given time.
A fierce showdown is about to begin!
So let's push forward with the other half of this. It isn't something one needs to understand if you play the more conventional characters of the game, but you do need to understand it if you play some of the odder ones. Specifically, something that comes up in other games that we call the multi-threat. One of the themes of our content this week. Backdashing away from your opponent reduces your threat to nearly zero. If you are a good zoner, you can get a bit, but you can see there that your opponent can actually, just like in most other fighting games, even though it doesn't look like it, if you're watching the opponent's character and not what is on the screen, you can often jump entirely over their beam attacks. On reaction, unlike most games where jumping over them properly on reaction can be a little hard, this game has a lot more ways of dealing with those things. Which always means, of course, that you can also vanish on reaction to most of these moves. It's just that vanish tends to be, depending on your character, vanish is wasteful. If your execution is good enough, you can do the cross-up stuff and get real damage. If your character has good cross-ups, note that, similar to most of the other characters I did play, her jumping kick hits on both sides. Because why would I ever play a character that doesn't do this? For a hit, I believe it is actually his jumping kick that does this. But as a general rule, you can get some good stuff off of just jumping. Because it changes your hitboxes around so much that opponents can be very confused by it. The key is to understand where to go from the jump and what you are capable of safely doing. If your execution is good, you can pose a lot of threat from various places on screen. And because this game has a relatively slow turnaround on moves and on characters, and many moves are in fact command style where they need to be held in a particular direction, it's not as easy for you to counter these things. In short, beams are so slow in this game that you can do a ton of things on reaction to them. And because, unlike many other games, the motion for doing what we are basically treating as supers, and I think they're actually called supers, is only one motion, one that you are probably comfortable with. It's relatively easy to do stuff like that. Just dash forward into level 3 and get through your opponent's stuff. Depending on the level 3, of course. But it's not, oh, my opponent is going to do this thing. Because I did not do that just because I figured that was happening. I could watch the opponent's character, and I'm holding forward anyways, just do a full to back and hit 2 buttons. And seeing literally the startup of his move means that I win at that moment. The beams in this game are much more about stopping opponents from taking certain approaches to get to you, and therefore are not as useful at mid-screen because they do take some time to actually start up to balance out the fact that they basically, relative to the regular speed of projectiles in fighting games, cross the screen immediately. So you have much more time to realize that they are happening if you can do anything about it. Therefore, standing at the other side of the screen and using beams works primarily on opponents who are very impatient, or who are more willing to waste their meter on raw vanish to deal with it. In other words, this is not your aim. They should be treated the same way people have been treating Ryu's in Street Fighter and Iori and Kyo's moves in King of Fighters for many years. When you're just out of range of everything else, but you know your opponent is coming at you, or they have put you far away, rather than you getting far away on your own, then you do it. Because if they have put you far away, they're usually in the mood to follow you. They're going to try to get there. If you backdash, they're already wary, they're on guard that you are going to do something from full screen. So avoiding the beam at that point is relatively easy. It's not really that zoning does not work in the game, it's that the way you have to think about the beams relative to the zoning, and just zoning in general, is different. The moves are more for catching things that your opponent thought they could get away with, because they will quickly cross the screen and deal with that problem without you having to do anything else. You don't have to worry about your opponent managing to get out of the hitbox or some other thing. This is why the diagonally downward ones are actually less effective than you'd expect, because they're even more telegraphed. You have to spend more time setting it up so that your opponent is not expecting them before you actually use them, except for Trunks, who can do whatever he wants. This is why the true zoners of the game have the ability to control which direction their beam is going to go. So if your thought is that you want to jump to get over the diagonal downward beam from Goku, Goku can simply throw the beam across. Similarly, if you decide to jump to get over Krillin's beam, Krillin will jump too and throw it in your face. That is what defines the zoner in this game. The ability to prepare a long-range attack and then vary that attack so that they don't end up being predictable and you should be able to get away from them every time. Everyone else has beams, not so much for zoning, but more so for punishing stuff that people randomly try to do in neutral without as much spacing. If you think your opponent is going to fall short, for example, this game has relatively stubby buttons, as we say. It's not really for with punishing. And a lot of the moves that you would normally use for this have slower startup. So you might as well use a beam so that your opponent must block, or at least be under pressure if they don't. This is why, despite the fact that Vegeta does not have a true beam, he's actually really effective at this, because the spacings at which you can use Vegeta's are entirely different. He has all of the same control points. The only difference between him and most other zoners is that you can't super dash through his. well, that you can super dash through his. Similarly, despite Piccolo having great space control, his homing projectile does not make him a zoner. It does not even make him good at zoning. What it does is lure the opponent into approaching him and getting caught in his other moves. Because he does not actually take that long to recover from sending his out. And he also does the move relatively quickly compared to most other projectiles. You cannot generally see Piccolo's orb coming and react to it.
It's all or nothing. Let's go.
It does look a lot like his other moves as well. This is likely to test your reflexes and cause you to do certain things. But since that is automatically defeated by all other more real beams, you can't consider Piccolo to be an effective zoner in any situation, really.
Piccolo, win.
俺たちは1年前とは比べ物にならんほど強くなった。
Brace yourself for the coming battle. Are you ready? Go!
One important point to note that may not have been obvious to those who have not played King of Fighters, or Guilty Gear to some extent. A forward dashing jump has a lower trajectory, but the amount of time spent in the air is often the same. The result is actually that if you jump normally, it may feel as if you're in the air for longer than if you do the forward dashing hop jump. This is most important for what I mentioned before, where you are going for mix-ups and similar based on your jumping attacks. If you end up too close to your opponent, you don't benefit at all from the dashing jump, and the ambiguity of the attack goes away. Your opponent may not be able to respond depending on what their character is able to do on cross-ups, but you will need more things, and because the number of moves that can be executed out of an air dash that will cancel your momentum are much less in this game than in Guilty Gear, you cannot generally do an instant air dash over the opponent's head and also set up a cross-up with most characters. Therefore, you need to put them far enough away from you to actually get the hop jump. I'm going to keep on using the KOF terminology. Basically you must super hop for this to make any sense. You can test this with your own characters whether or not they can cancel meaningful attacks out of their instant air dash style jump, but it is definitely not the same sort of feeling, and therefore not as powerful a thing. It is more so for closing in on an opponent who was not expecting to jump, and you jump to avoid a normal while at a decent, relatively far out range, but it is not generally or cross-ups or similar mix-ups on most characters. I believe Trunks has them, but I don't know all of the details on how. I know that Cell and Frieza have them, but aside from that, I don't think I've seen many characters that actually do it because their moves tend to hit in front of them, and they can't cancel the momentum of the dash to actually have themselves turn around and then do the move without their opponent being able to counter it. Since your opponent can usually dash forward away from these sorts of cross-ups, even if they have a slow startup on their dash, if you don't have a true cross-up attack, which is usually limited by the super hop, you should not be expecting this to be a way for you to get pressure. This also ties back into simpler things, like which character you use on point, because your style is defined somewhat by this. Part of the reason Hit is on point for me, even though he doesn't necessarily do that well there in my style, is because since Hit has no cross-up, and has to rely a lot on trickiness when the opponent wants to counterattack, he needs more meter to make them feel more pressured in neutral. Whereas Piccolo can do without meter entirely because Piccolo's entire way of fighting is based around already crossing up whenever he can. And his strong ability to get out of pressure like that. As you can see, depending on your execution with Cell, you should be able to do it.
無駄だ。どうした。
で楽しませてくれよ。
Counter!
行くぞ。究極のパワーを見せてやる。
Wonderful!
終わりだ。血が焼けるな。受けてみろ。さてと。
どこ見てんのさ。や17号。
さて。
まだそら。やるね。どこ見てんのさ。まだ。や。そら。もっと楽しもうか。身の程知れ。
やってやるか。
黙っときな。
そこを譲ってやる。
や。そら。
今度は本気でやらせてもらうぞ。今度は本気でやらせてもらうぞ。
黙っときな。行くよ。あんたの力が見たいわ。
覚悟はいいか。逃げられるか。甘い。終わりだ。甘い。覚悟はいいか。そう楽しませてもらおう。終わりだ。交代だ。
そら。や。
なんだと。
勝たせてもらうよ。くら
惜しかったな。さて。今度は俺が相手だ。何か全体それでもくれ。この貴様が相手。俺ならそうぜ。消えるそこだ。終わりだ。わかんこだ。この雑魚だ。こいつは俺のターゲット。これはどうだ。こちらだ。これはどうだ。こちらだ。俺様が止まれ。止まれ。止まれ。来るか。来るか。フライ。防いでみろ。こういう攻撃も見せてみろ。任務完了だ。仕事は終えた。次のターゲットは誰だ。
The easiest way to make this decision normally is that if your character requires you to use meter to assure a mix-up, that character should almost never be your point character. Obviously, it is not as simple as that, but in general, if you want to keep pressure on your opponent, but in order to do so safely, you must have at least the threat of using your meter to do so. That character is going to be at least somewhat disadvantaged because they have to constantly save their meter for these things. They're either weaker on defense or weaker on offense if on point at all times. This is especially true online when you are going up in point versus point battles where you don't necessarily know what your opponent's point character will be and how strong they will be against yours. You're much safer trying to switch out into a character that would be a better matchup for their point while using a character who is just a good point character on their own. One example of this is that I probably could also play Hit on Point in certain matchups. And overall, he's not a terrible character to have there because his meter doesn't really give him good mix-ups of the standard kind. However, since I don't use the standard kind of mix-up, that is why he ended up in the position he's in my team. Similarly, whether or not Adult Gohan is a point character to you or not, mostly depends on whether or not you want to use him for his good footsies and keep out, or want to use him for putting pressure on people with his awakened form and therefore needing her to not only get there, but can cancel into that if your main point character can manage to get meter on their own for both of those things.
Brace yourself for the coming battle! Are you ready? Go!
くだらん。行くこちら防いでみろ。許さん。
あいつ本当に強いよ。
さてどうしたどうした
まだまだ。やっ
さっさと破壊してやる。ださてこの私にバリーを張らせるとどうした
驚いたよ。
スピードには自信があるんだ。ターゲットは俺が仕留める。さて
You must, however, be careful not to become too predictable about certain things you do.
来いこちらだ。この程度楽しませてくれ。さあ受けてみろ。
Because if your opponent sees that you will continually respond to their pressure in a certain way, you will lose very quickly once they choose that specific moment in which they have a counter to you.
1対1ならこいつやるな。終わりだ。
そこは譲ってやろう。
終わりだ。終わりだ。セルがいい。
This particularly applies when you are a person who plays characters who have a lot of easy or relatively easy buttons for blocking out other attacks, such as that. Your opponent will learn your rhythm eventually. And once they do, it becomes relatively easy for them to change the situation on you. However, it may be much harder for you to force your own rhythm to change. So whereas you are dealing with what is effectively a speed reaction, making sure that your attacks are fast enough that your opponent does not get their own attack started. The fact that you consistently do this leads to your opponent learning the speed at which you hit your own, and they will take over the rhythm of the match very quickly. This is not really related to autopiloting your defense, but rather having the specific belief that by continually doing what you are doing in terms of hitting a quick button to check your opponent's offense, that you will continue to have success. In most fighting games, the interaction that is occurring after two players have that clash over and over is that one of them is building up meter faster than the other. Usually the one on defense that is succeeding at this, but the other one is still building up meter. And as soon as they have the opportunity to trick you, you are basically down to a guessing game that you created yourself. No, no, that's no damage. I'm just using meter now.
逃がさないぞ。
Similarly, from the other side, this match is usually just, oh, let me defend until Rillian makes a mistake in this particular way. Which only works long enough for this to happen. Once the situation reverses, it's basically the same thing. Unfortunately, this response is not much better. Because once one becomes desperate and the opponent is able to see this, what I mentioned before will happen. They will take your attention off their own meter by using it, and then just wait until you get desperate and they get meter back and destroy you. So do be careful with your perceptions of the feelings of the match. Because you have to be able to recognize when you're being set up for something. Your opponent's options are to play randomly to try to stop everything you do, or to take certain attacks from you to give you the impression that they have gone into a particular mental state, and then break your expectations. This can be done on defense just as well, if you have the health to sacrifice to do it. Another reason why being able to space your opponent this far away from you is good is simply because you get to see their attacks coming from so far away. For defensive players, this is extremely useful. But it can lead to them being caught by characters such as Frieza and Cell, who can just not actually get any closer and still attack. Fortunately for most of us, Cell's command grab actually has a fairly long startup, and you would have to push your opponent to the mental state that you were not going to do that, and just going to rush in. This team therefore is particularly strong because of the ability to just do assists which lock your opponent down and make them wonder whether or not you're going to come for them or not. Vegeta's largest weakness as a character is that without support, he really does have a relatively linear attack form of his game plan. Fortunately, you still have the option of playing Vegeta in any position for this reason. It is more so that if you play him on point, you generally have to conserve the EX moves, the moves done with the heavy button, of your other characters. Simply because you need as much meter as possible for Vegeta to have a non-linear attack plan.
Showdown is about to begin! Are you ready? Go!
こいつはどうだい。そら黙っていな。17号
今度は本気でやらせてもらうぞ。
17号
するな。この野郎。今だ。覚悟はいいか。どうした交代か。まぐれだ。見せてみろ。見せてみろ。お前たちはどこか遠くへ避難している。じゃあ少しだけ。
He clearly not going anywhere that way, so let's go back to this.
これはどうだ。こちらだ。これはどうだ。これはどうだ。こちらだ。こちらだ。これはどうだ。こちらだ。これはどうだ。こちらだ。これはどうだ。動くな。こういう攻撃もある。
勝たせてもらうよ。17に勝たせてもらうよ。食らえ。ほっ、食らっときな。行くよ。ほっ。
どうした交代か。受けてみろ。食らえ。受けてみろ。背後に気をつけろ。来い。逃がさん。防いでみろ。許さん。背後に気をつけろ。来い。逃がさん。全体のこの無駄だ。
軽いね。黙っときな。黙っときな。
俺たちがやりたいことになる。
はっ、この野郎。この野郎。デンジャラスマシンガン。驚いたよ。食らっときな。行くよ。それ。黙っときな。加減が難しい。それ。黙っときな。やんちゃが過ぎるってもんだ。
もしもっと腕を上げることができたらまた相手になってやると言っておいてくれ。
So we're bringing the stream to a close after the upcoming match.
あんた自身はあんまり神様らしくないけど。
Join us next week for more Kame House. And the final piece of the quote-unquote puzzle, if you haven't figured it out yourself by then. Note, of course, that everything for variable characters still needs to be fleshed out, and you can check across Twitter, DBFZ Tech, similar things. But as far as universal mechanics are concerned, and understanding characters relative to those, there's only one more thing to go over.
Are you ready? Let's go!
すぐに終わらせてやる。まだまだ。はっ。 楽しませてくれよ。
いきますよ、ベジータさん。話にならん。本気でいくぞ。熱いな。飛べ。行くぞ。汗こっちだ。どうした
貴様が相手。
And with that flying, destructive finish, we bring our stream to a close for the night. Join us tomorrow. If you are interested in Street Fighter V, we will be doing the Kata 31 information during that stream. And next week we'll be continuing with our various lobbies. This has been Rillian for 2MK. Good night, everyone.